Welcome everyone, 207 of us so far. Welcome to this session 3 of History Day 2020 on new approaches to local and community history. I'm Clarke. I'm a professor based at the Institute of Historical Research, and I'm director of our Centre for the History of People, Place and Community. Thanks so much for joining this panel discussion and show and tell session today. I'm really looking forward to it. This session is part of History Day 2020 and also the Being Human Festival. It's hosted by, this particular session is hosted with the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community at the Institute of Historical Research. And our centre fosters work into placed histories in all regions and periods, from the rural to the urban, the parish to the metropolis. And we're really interested in engaged, outward-looking collaborative research. We're home to projects like the Victoria County History of England, which celebrated its 120th birthday last year, or the digital crowdsourced public history project Layers of London. We've also just launched our first MOOC, a free open online course, which is particularly of relevance to anyone interested in local and community history, with lots of brilliant case study projects and inspiration and tips and resources. And I've just put a link into the chat. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our wonderful panel today, and they're going to share some of their own new approaches to local and community history over recent months, and particularly, I think, in the context of the new world of doing local and community and engaged history since the COVID-19 pandemic. Each of our presenters is going to share a show and tell item, which represents some aspect of their local and community history activity. Here's my own show and tell object. Some of you might have seen I shared on Twitter earlier, so go and take a look at that if you want to know the story behind my muddy welly. And we might come back to some of those show and tell objects later. So we're going to begin with 5-minute micro presentations from our panel. Then we'll move on to some panel discussion and conversation, and then open questions and discussion. And there will also be opportunities during this session for you to share any show and tell items that you've brought with you to represent any aspects of your own local or community history activity. And remember that we'd love you to share those objects, those items on Twitter as well. If you do that, please do use the History Day hashtag HistDay20. And please do feel free to live tweet this conversation as well, and share what's going on here with the world. I just wanted to note that the final member of our panel today, Tom Hughes, is also over on Twitter rather than being here in our virtual Zoom room, and he's getting the discussion started there. Tom works at Dumfries and Galloway Museum, and he has some really interesting projects and I think sort of provocations and challenges to share around doing digital engagement in 2020, suggesting ways that we might respond to digital access issues and exclusion, and do our engagement in ways other than those requiring access to online platforms. So that's enough preamble. We will move straight on with the presentations from our panel today. And we're going to start with our first panelist, Gary Tuson of History Begins at Home. Gary's County Archivist at Norfolk County Council, and he's the campaign lead for History Begins at Home, a wonderful project that I'm sure many of you have come across, that's using history to connect people and to tackle loneliness during the COVID-19 crisis. So over to you, Gary.
Hello, everybody. Yes, so yes, I'm going to talk to you about History Begins at Home. History Begins at Home began as a reaction to the COVID crisis. Lots of things were going on across archives across the UK, and we felt that we wanted to come together to do something which really helped with people's mental well-being during lockdown. So the idea was to, as Catherine says, to try and stimulate conversation about the past between people. As fun, you know, we don't do anything too heavy, but we want to get people interested. Lots of people perhaps aren't so interested in history, but they are interested in the more recent past, and we wanted to stimulate intergenerational conversation between friends as much as possible. So what we do is we put out lots of provocations for question suggestions on social media. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. And we also have a website where each fortnight we put out a new theme, which we put out a question sheet for and try and stimulate conversations that way. So we've looked at things like nights out, school days, food, hobbies, lots of things, new things coming up all the time, and we've put videos out and lots of content. That's very roughly what History Begins at Home is. And I better talk about this by show and tell, because that's the main focus, isn't it? And we'll talk about it more later, I'm sure. And I've cheated a little bit, I'm afraid, because I was asked to bring one item and I've sort of bought two. But this is it. I don't know how well you can see that. But this is an album called Ray Antony at the Tower. It's a jazz album from 1956. First big band album recorded at the Capitol Tower. It's not brilliant. Yeah, I bought it for a charity shop for 99p. And if I really had to whittle down my albums, I might not keep it. But the second thing I bought is this. This is an album called Ray Antony, Jam Session at the Tower. Album recorded in 1956, first big band recording at the Capitol Tower. This is the one which was in the radiogram at home when I was growing up. So I associate this with the smell of lifting up the radiogram. I associate it with the other records which are in there, a couple of Ella Fitzgerald songbook albums and a Mel Torme at the Crescendo, so I've got those memories. But it was my dad's radiogram. It's his birthday today, in fact, and I'll be talking to him about this in a minute. So this is a record which he bought when he was 25. So this is a conversation starter for us to talk about his musical taste in the past and what he liked and when he bought that great radiogram, which is one of those things which it's one of those things that I wish my parents had never thrown away, because it was a superb object, superb bit of furniture. But it's a great way of opening up a conversation. That's what we're trying to do. And part of what we realise is we've lived lots of our lives with our families and people we know, but we don't know that much about them. There's so much more we can always find out about people, what they've done in the past. And one of the things we're trying to do is have a quality conversation. We've all had lots of us have done our bits during lockdown, realizing people are lonely, and we want to engage with those people by ringing them up. But sometimes you get a bit bored of talking about coronavirus. So what we want to use is conversations about the past to actually engage and connect with people on a much more meaningful, satisfying level. So in fact, the whole project is built around the concept of the 5 ways to well-being. One of the really important one of those is connect. They are connect, take notice, keep learning, give, and be active. And part of what we find from the conversations is you're ringing somebody up and you're both giving to each other in the conversation, because you're making that real connection and you're learning about some people's lives, and you're keeping learning. So I think we hit 4 of the 5 ways on the head. Being active is a little bit more difficult. The other side of it, of course, is we're using a lot of social media, but we realise that lots of people we want to connect with each other don't use IT at all, possibly. But there's nothing wrong with the telephone. So part of what we're trying to get to people, we said to people, well, why don't you pick up the phone? Ask these questions, have that conversation. But on top of that as well, we want people to capture those conversations, because this is a really important part of our personal and our social history. So we've got tips on our website on how to record conversations, what you can do. And finally, we want people to share online. We want people to tell us the stories, the interesting things they learned, because it's a great thing to get a conversation about. And the more we can do to get people interested in their own local and personal history, the better for us all and the better for society. There we are. That's my 5 minutes, I think.
That's absolutely terrific, Gary. Thank you so much, and wonderful to see such a meaningful and suggestive object for your show and tell, with all the memories that carries. Actually, in our MOOC that we're running, we have a section on oral history, and music and food are the 2 kind of conversation starters for the oral history. They're partly inspired by a brilliant project collecting the oral histories of Syrian refugees we took some inspiration from. And I think music is just one of those topics, isn't it, where it really draws out people's memories and experiences. That's fantastic.
Yeah. Especially men as well, which is a really important one for making those connections, because that can be the more difficult connection sometimes.
Yeah, and opening up and tackling
Card
loneliness.
works pretty well as well. Yeah.
Fantastic. A really inspiring project, Gary. Thank you so much. So we'll now move to the second speaker. on our panel today, and that is Aimee Baruwa. And Aimee is a volunteer with the Young Historians Project. This is a brilliant non-profit organisation formed by young people encouraging the development of young historians of African and Caribbean heritage in Britain. They're a team of young people aged 16 to 25 and working on really exciting and dynamic projects, documenting pivotal and often overlooked historical moments. And Aimee's work is as a volunteer, and I think it's tremendous to see what volunteers on the Young Historians Project are bringing to history and heritage today. So Aimee, I know you want to share your screen. Where are you, Aimee?
Yeah, hello everyone. I'll just share my screen now.
That's brilliant. And then over to you, Aimee, when that's up and running.
Can everyone see it?
Perfect.
Yes, so I volunteer with the Young Historians Project. I personally do archaeology and anthropology at uni, but I felt like I wanted to do something that contributed to like the discussion about Black British history. So the object I have, sadly I don't have it physically, is a nurse's uniform of one of the women that we've interviewed. So this is Adwa, and this was the nursing uniform she used to use, that she wore, I think, in the late 80s and 90s. And Adwa is a really interesting woman, and we asked her questions about her experience in working in the NHS and the British Healthcare Service. And you can see in the picture how proud she is to wear that uniform. Our project is all about the significant role that African women have played in the British healthcare system, and I felt that this image kind of represented that. When she wore this uniform, she was working in a nursing home as a nurse and also living there. And she describes like a sense of community with the other nurses. So I feel like her uniform just represents a lot of like that feeling of community and being part of something like bigger than yourself. So a bit more about what YHP do. So currently, our project is a hidden history African women in the British Healthcare Service, 1930 to 2000. So some of our key themes in our research. So like the individual stories of African women are important to us. So we've interviewed over 40 women of African heritage about their experiences, whether nurses, doctors, specialists, things like that. Some had been recruited to the NHS, for example, and we've done archival research as well to look at how women have been coming to the UK and training to be nurses and doctors from the beginning of the 20th century from Africa. We also want to highlight how the ethical debate around recruitment from the global south, like countries in Africa, and how that impacts their healthcare services, for example. So through our interviews, we've also started looking at experiences of fostering and how a lot of students, African students that came over, that there was a point where they were encouraged to bring their family. And through that, there were a lot of children that were fostered with white middle class families. And so it just shows an interesting dynamic with how some African children grew up with white families, for example, and then went back home, and the problems that arose through that as well. Currently, we're putting together a documentary series and online exhibition on our project in an accessible form. Yes, so that's what YHP does. Just a little get in touch. If you want to find out more, there's lots of information on our website. I think I'll put that in the chat as well. But yeah, thank you.
That's fantastic, Aimee. Thank you so much. Such an inspiring project. And I think, healthcare is just another of those topics, isn't it, where, it kind of touches everyone's lives, and we all have experiences to share, and really important stories that you're recovering and you're telling and sharing there, Aimee. Thank you. I'm sure we'll come back to some of that. So next, I'd like to introduce two speakers who are representing the British Association for Local History. So we have Daniela Gonzalez and Claire Kennan with us. Daniela is Social Media Fellow and Claire is Digital Engagement Fellow for the British Association for Local History. And I know I've watched with great excitement as they've launched some brilliant initiatives over this past year. And Daniela and Claire are going to talk to us about that. I think you want to screen share, is that right?
No, we've just got an object.
Fantastic. I'll hand over to you then. Thanks.
Right, perfect. It's so nice to see so many people here. And first, I'm going to speak a little bit about the origins of our 10-minute talks, and then I'm going to hand over to Claire, who will talk a bit more about how they've developed, and she's going to be talking about our lovely shared object. So throughout the year, the British Association for Local History, which is the national charity that is dedicated to promoting local history and serving local historians, have been hard at work developing their digital strategy, particularly because of the challenges and disruption posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. So the 10-minute talks is just one of these many initiatives that was implemented as a response to the coronavirus pandemic and lockdown. Very much the brainchild of Jill Draper, who is our Events and Development Officer. The 10-minute talks were initiated as a way to replace some of the in-person talks and physical meetings that BALH had planned for 2020. So whilst nothing beats meeting in person, with the limitations of social distancing in place, these talks have become another way to share our enjoyment and interest in local history to a much wider audience. And when they first started, the idea was for the 10-minute talks to take the form of a PowerPoint presentation accompanied by notes, but they've recently been developed as part of our digital strategy that Claire is going to tell you more about. And we've had many different subjects being covered. So for example, we've got a talk about livestock in 17th century Knoll, and other topics such as the old shops in South Bank in York. Now, at the beginning, when they were first implemented, the 10-minute talks were only open to members of BALH, but more recently and over the last few weeks, this has also been extended to non-members. So if you would like to submit a 10-minute talk to us, do please get in contact and I'll write our email and include the link in the chat. I'll hand over to you, Claire.
Thank you. So our object that we've brought along is my very nice John Lewis clock that I actually bought in lockdown. Hilariously, it's very analog when we're talking about digital engagement, so you'll have to excuse that. As Daniela said, yeah, so we had this wonderful idea of these 10-minute talks, and along with the traditional format that Daniela's just described with the PowerPoint and the notes, we thought that actually it would be great to start encouraging people to film their 10-minute talks, so still presenting with their PowerPoint, but actually seeing and hearing them on camera. We were then able to upload the videos to our website and also to our YouTube channel, so reaching an even wider audience. And the videos, initially we thought, well, we'll see how it goes. We'll do one a month and, you know, that might be enough for now. But it's been so popular that we are now releasing them every 2 weeks because we've had so many people get in touch, local historians, really quite senior scholars, early career researchers, students, teachers, all kinds of people with these amazing local history stories. And as Daniela was mentioning, these are part of this wider digital engagement package that we've been developing. So as well as these 10-minute talks, we've got a podcast that's going to be launching in 2021, online skills training sessions, Q&A webinars, an online lecture series. We're developing school resources with teachers. So COVID has really sort of propelled BALH into the 21st century, and we've now got this entire package that we're offering members and non-members alike. So if you do have an exciting local history story, or if you would even like to talk about your object that you've brought along today and it's linked to local history, do get in touch with us. You can find all of the talks we've got so far on our website, and I think Daniela has popped the link for that in the chat box for you. So thank you very much.
What a brilliant invitation, Daniela and Claire. I sense that there are going to be loads of wonderful local history stories, aren't there, in this virtual room tied to people's objects. So please do get in touch with Daniela and Claire if you want to share your story. And I think that's such a wonderful example with the British Association for Local History of responding to the kind of the new world we find ourselves in, and thinking in such creative ways about how to move activities, how to do things differently. But I actually really like, Claire, that you had an analog clock alongside talking about the digital, because, you know, Gary talked about using the phone. We've got Tom over on Twitter talking about using old village notice boards. And so I love the way that we've got this whole ecosystem of different ways to engage. And I'm sure that's something that we'll be thinking more about during the session. Thank you. So our final project being represented on the panel today is being represented for us by Colin, Hyde and Helen Foster. Colin is project manager for the Unlocking Our Sound Heritage project in the East Midlands Hub. And Helen is research assistant and outreach officer for the East Midlands Oral History Archive, and they're both based at the University of Leicester. And I will hand over Helen and Colin to you now. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Yes, hello, I'm Colin and I'm managing the Midlands Hub of the Unlocking Our Sound Heritage project, and I'll pass over to Helen at the end of this first bit. The UOSH project, as we call it, is a British Library project that has substantial funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and it's being carried out by the British Library and 10 hubs based around the UK. It's a major audio preservation project that is making tens of thousands of digitized recordings available to the public for the first time. And a major part of the project is outreach. So across the 10 hubs, this work will consist of engaging volunteers in all aspects of the digital preservation process, showing people how to edit and work with sound, use sound clips as resources for carers, working with people who have dementia, working in schools, local communities, interest groups, with artists who can bring in new and creative ways of working with sound. Now, as you'll all know, using sound archives for local history isn't new, obviously, but it is still something that many people and groups don't use as much as they could. And this is down to several factors. You have to be able to discover that the recordings exist, you have to be able to access them, to listen to them, and you have to know how to use them. So we're hoping that the training that we're giving to volunteers and the interactions we're having with groups will enable others to spread the skills and our love of sound recordings long after this project is over. The sound clip we're going to hear, which is our object, was created by Ewan Shaw, who's one of our volunteers. And Ewan wanted to learn how to digitize old recordings. So he was able to work through boxes of unidentified tapes from the County Record Office in Leicestershire, which proved to be a real treasure trove with recordings going back as far back as 1953. So I'll pass over to Helen and she can play you one of these.
Okay, thank you, Colin. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the clip before I play it. The clip itself dates from 1959 and it was recorded in Leicester Museum by a museum official. It's a recording of a man that we only know as a Mr. W. English, and he comes from Braunstone, which by 1959 had become a really developed residential part of Leicester. Prior to that, it had been a fairly small village in the county of Leicestershire. Mr. English is singing a song for us, so we're continuing the musical theme here, and he tells us that the song he's singing was passed from his grandfather to his father and then on to him. So there's a really important family tradition here as well. The song is called The Apple Tree, and a little bit of research has found that it appears in hymn books and verses as early as 1829, and it has more verses than those that we hear Mr. English sing. So we suspect that this could be one of the earliest local recordings of a folk song. And just a brief summary of what he's singing about. It's about a man called Old Johnny. And Old Johnny has a lovely, healthy green apple tree, which is creaking with ripe codlings or cooking apples. But Old Johnny is a poor man, and he makes a little money for food by selling apples to passing children. But his neighbour, a young lad by the name of Little Dicky, covets these apples. And when he tries to take them behind Old Johnny's back, he's given quite a stern warning. And hopefully you'll pick that up as I play this for you now.
This is a recording of a folk song made by Mr. W. English of Braunston, Leicestershire, and recorded in Leicester Museum on the 21st of January 1959.
Tell me when you're ready.
Yes, we're all ready, Mr. English.
Well, I wonder how you like this song. This is a little song that my father taught me when I was a little boy, not above 4 years old. My father, had he lived now, he'd have been 110 years old, and his father taught it him. So, of course, it's at least 106 years old, this is. And it's a song that's always clung to me right up to the present day, and I'm 76, and I still sing it. I'll just sing it to you. Old John, he had an apple tree, healthy and green. It bore the best codlings that ever was seen. So beautiful, mellow and red. And as they were ripe, and old John, he was poor, he sold them to children that passed by his door, just to buy him a morsel of bread. Little Dickie, next neighbour, you oft times might see, with longing eyes viewing that nice apple tree, and wishing a codling might fall. Little boy, take your hand from the bough. Remember old John, he can't see you just now, but there's one who by night, just as well as by day, can see all you do and can hear all you say, and his glory is throned in the sky. How do you like that?
Oops. Okay, so that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Helen and Colin. Oh, that was quite moving hearing Mr. English sing that song from his childhood, you know, back in the 50s. I did love his "How do you like that?" at the end. I also love that we're doing a kind of multimedia show and tell with objects and sound as well. That's fantastic. Really wonderful to have a voice from the past there and to hear more about your wonderful project. So I'm going to ask a few questions to the panel, and panelists, you know, feel free to chip in on questions that interest you and respond to each other. Everyone else in the room, we'd love to have any questions from you too. If you want to ask a question, you've got a couple of options. You can type it into the chat box, or you can indicate in the chat box that you want to ask a question. Or if you're happy to ask your question on camera yourself, you can raise your hand in the participants panel. So I can't promise we'll get to everyone, but we will try to take some questions from the room. But I'll start with a question for the panel. So I'm very struck by the fact that all of your projects really are in various ways engaged with widening and diversifying participation in local and community history. You're involving new people in new ways. You're getting people to think about different kinds of sources, or to think about sources in new ways. In terms of that widening and diversifying participation, what do you think are the continuing challenges or opportunities in these areas at the moment? And I don't know who wants to start on that from the panel. Daniela, it looks like you might have something to say.
Yeah, I guess in terms of the opportunities, and one of the things that I've really liked to see in the 10-minute talks is just, learning so much about topics perhaps that I wouldn't have been particularly familiar with beforehand, just learning about people's backgrounds, where they come from, and the fact that we've had so much support for this initiative and had such a wide call. I mean, Claire can back this up. We get email after email with people saying, I want to contribute a 10-minute talk. Is that possible? And obviously one of the larger opportunities, as we mentioned during the talk, is the fact that it's not just coming from BALH members, as Claire elaborated. We've had them from senior scholars, early career researchers, PhD students, people who I'm sure that you've seen on Twitter, people who work on one place studies. So it's really nice actually that our BALH family has become extended and it's become a much larger community. Claire, if you want to comment on that as well, or
yeah, and I was just going to say, I think one of the things that 2020 has done is it's sort of broken down some of the traditional barriers between sort of different bits of history, and everyone's just kind of been, getting involved. And I think probably because we've all been stuck at home and you've been for a walk in your local town centre and noticed things that you perhaps didn't pay much attention to before. So there seems to have been a real sort of surge in interest in local history from all areas. As I said, we've had interest from teachers, students, scholars, local history groups, HLF projects. It's been incredible, and we have had to really sort of ramp up how many of these 10-minute talk videos we're releasing, because we weren't quite anticipating.
You've created a big job for yourselves, haven't you? You really have. And I think we might come back to that topic of the local in a moment, really. Aimee, I wanted to come to you actually as well on this question, because I think one of the things that's so important and special about the Young Historians Project is that kind of connection between past and present and future, isn't it? And in terms of kind of fostering and supporting, the historians of tomorrow through the project as well. And can you say any more about, what you can see the project doing in terms of including and involving new people in history, or giving space to new voices? Is that something you could reflect on?
I feel like YHP provides a space for Black British students to feel that that they're encouraged in learning history, and history that is particularly relevant to them, that it can reflect their own struggles and things like that. Yeah.
Brilliant. It's great, I think, to see in that project, right the way through from the research to the leadership of the project, coming from those young people. It's extremely inspiring. It's a wonderful project. Any of our other panelists want to come in on this question around diversifying and widening participation at all? Helen. And then Gary.
I suppose one thing to say would be that oral history is a very accessible source for people to be involved in its creation. It's a very grassroots way of people recording their stories, the stories of the everyday. And I don't want to say ordinary because they're not ordinary, but it can really be used to engage participants in recording their own histories and exploring their own heritages. I suppose one of the obstacles then is the digital itself, because one of the things with lockdown has been great. We've been able to use digital technology in so many interesting ways, and particularly with digital oral history, but then you're going to automatically exclude some people who don't use that. And when it comes to oral history, I think there's still a place for the analog in some way. Particularly as well, thinking about Gary's project, that the idea of talking about your stories and sharing those has those therapeutic and well-being benefits as well, which particularly this year have been incredibly important. But I still think there are lots of challenges with making with including people into oral history projects in particular, and then making it accessible. But that's all part of the fun of exploring new ideas.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Over this year, we've kind of been including in new ways and opening up and reaching out, but thinking about lines of exclusion in these new ways. And again, Tom is kind of giving us some provocations around that over on Twitter. And Gary, you wanted to come in on this too.
Yeah, well, I've always thought that one of the strengths of our sector is that we've got so much stuff. And, in Norfolk, I like to think that our collections actually have got something which is directly personally relevant to every single person in the county. So we've got this huge opportunity through making it available, accessible in different ways and putting stuff out there to really get people connecting with our collections. And that builds up new interest in them because you're starting at, you know, that very personal level. And it's a bit like the classic route where some people start researching their family history and become interested in family history and then became very, very keen local historians. Their research expands out. And I think, you know, the more we can do with that, the better.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah, so much starts, I think, with our local archives and record offices and local museums in terms of inspiring and sparking interest in history and projects for people. There's lots more questions I want to ask. I can see some brilliant questions coming through in the chat as well. I thought we could just take a moment now, though, to see what kinds of show and tell objects we have in the room, because it's lovely seeing everyone's faces, but it would be great to see what else we might be getting on camera. So if you brought a show and tell object with you that you can hold up, now is the moment to share it with all of us. I'm going to get close up to my muddy welly again. You've been sharing your objects over on Twitter, and that is brilliant too. So do scroll through to get a look at any objects that you can see on screen. Some really intriguing objects here. Thank you so much to people who have brought things. Now, I'd really like to see if anyone would like to say something. Now, I don't know if I'm being foolish here, but I can see Mary Fraser in the chat has said she'd really love to tell us about her ancient truncheon. Could this be a risky one to pick up? I don't know. Mary, dare we ask to see your ancient truncheon? And could you tell us super briefly, like a kind of spoken tweet, what that represents for you?
Thanks very much, Catherine. Yes, this is a truncheon, which is probably dating from about mid-1800. And it's beautifully painted. It's from Greenock, and it was given to my husband's great-grandfather because he became a special constable. And I imagine it was used on Saturday nights with all the drunks. So it's a brilliant object. It's wood. So if you got hit with it, you'd certainly know it. And it has a leather strap at the bottom so that the policeman would be able to hold it, and a good hand grip. So I think it's beautiful. The crest on it is the crest of the police itself, you know, the police force that this came from. And you can see a number of truncheons in the police museums nationally. There are probably about 16 police museums nationally, and a lot of them have these, and they'll have the different crests on them. So I think they're really interesting objects.
Thanks so much for bringing it along, Mary. An object that, my goodness, really has a life and a biography of its own, the stories it could tell, and really bedded into your own family history as well. That's wonderful. I noticed that Ian McCracken in the chat also mentioned a zine that he's brought along that reflects some of his local and community history work. Ian, are you in the room? Would you like to share your zine with us?
Yeah. But I was just doing something there. I've got another, I'm meeting the group I'm with are doing a session at 6 p.m. So I had to get some stuff there.
So we'd love to see your zine if you have that with you.
I'm just got it on screen. If you bear with me till I share.
You might not be able to share a screen, Ian. We don't have that set up for participants in the meeting. Maybe you could just tell us briefly about your zine.
I've actually got a printed copy, so I can get that in a moment.
Perfect. And I think we've all been in Ian's place, haven't we, with multiple Zoom meetings open on our desktop at the same time and juggling between that. The suspense. Here we are. Here comes Ian's zine. Right. Fantastic. So just tell us ever so briefly about this, Ian.
Yeah, just show you a couple of the illustrations. Let me know if I'm too near or too far.
And is this something that you worked on in a community group? Was this a kind of collaboration?
Yeah, there's a community centre in the area called Kennan Park in Glasgow. They originally occupied the building about 25 years ago and have now got great government funding to make it into a community centre. And again, once their refurbishment is complete, lots of different e-tins for people coming from other cultures, asylum seekers,
That's
etc.
wonderful.
For food, there's lots of art project. The Tara, that's the leader for a group, had a studio there. So we got a couple of sessions set up, and people came along by invitation through loads of social media channels. Myself and the others had collected the pictures. I did the research, and then
Great.
people come up with the ideas of how to illustrate. So we've now made posters of
That's brilliant, Ian. I can see there's real interest in your zine in the chat, and there are some questions about that you might want to respond to. I think I'm sure there are people in the room who've had experience of using zines. Aren't they a brilliant way of kind of bringing together different kinds of talents and focusing around a project and making an intervention? Thanks so much for sharing that, Ian. Really, really wonderful to see.
If you want me to put in my email, then people could contact me after the session.
I wouldn't necessarily advise putting your personal email in the chat, but there might be questions you can answer in the chat, Ian, or we could put you in touch with people afterwards. Thank you.
Yeah.
Brilliant. I can see some other really good general questions coming through in the chat, actually, and we'll try and bring some of these now to the panel. So there's a question from Richard Sylvester around crowdsourcing. Richard, do you want to ask that on camera? If not, I can read that from the chat.
Will you just read it for me? Thank you.
So Richard's asking, he's saying how interesting it is that some of the objects we've seen, like the album or the audio recording, depend on a story for contextualization. So he's been reflecting on sourcing stories and stories around objects, and his question is to do with online crowdsourcing. Is this, do you think of your projects at all in terms of crowdsourcing? What would the value of crowdsourcing be? Is that something that has a meaning for the way that you work? What's the value of crowdsourcing? What can we do with that? So thoughts around crowdsourcing. Anyone on the panel want to take that? It's quite a new term, isn't it? Quite a buzz term, but actually I think it describes, I often describe the Victoria County history as a crowdsourced project invented before we had that terminology for it. Gary, you want to unmute?
Yeah, I think crowdsourcing is a fascinating thing, and it's got huge opportunities, and it's been incredibly successful, because crowdsourcing really took off with the Zooniverse project. I'm sure some people are familiar with that, when they worked out that they could identify galaxies by using volunteers rather than grad students, and they had about 1 million volunteers. You know, it's ridiculous, and they discovered a new type of galaxy, and since then it's been used in lots and lots of different ways. But what I'm very interested in different ways of generating metadata, because what sits in the middle of the user and the collections is incredibly important, and the more we can use crowdsourcing to generate that. But the other great thing about crowdsourcing is one of the things with archives is, once you've looked at them visually, they're not very interesting quite often. Yeah, we've got some fascinating objects, but most of them tend to be a bit brown and writing. But if you engage with them, they become really fascinating. And one way of getting people to engage with archives is through crowdsourcing, because if people are going through them and identifying people in them, or places or subjects in them, they've got to really engage on a different level. So that opens up the collections to people in a different way, and I think that's really, really useful thing to do.
That's great. Any other thoughts from our panel on crowdsourcing as a sort of methodology or a way of thinking about what you're doing? Sorry, Claire.
I was just going to say, for local history and a lot of the projects that we're aware of as an association, crowdsourcing is hugely important for getting research done, particularly local history projects, for example, looking at the involvement of a community in one of the world wars. That's a really, really popular thing that people crowdsource and use research in that way. There's a number of projects that will be featured on our upcoming podcast, sorry, shameless plug, that have used crowdsourcing. It's such an important way of doing history, and particularly for local communities when you're trying to cover a vast amount of information and get it all into one place.
if you do want to say anything in the panel and I haven't noticed you, just give me a wave and I will come to you. There's another question in the chat that I'd like to turn to, and this is from Caris Fyson, which I'll read. Asking, has anyone got any tips for enticing young people into engaging with history and contributing to projects like these? We're a record office with a largely middle-aged demographic, which is still great, but they would like to engage more young people. And I think we've probably got lots of really good insights and perspectives on the panel in terms of, Aimee, your expertise in terms of, inspiring younger people, expertise in terms of archives and collections. So Claire, we'll start with you.
I would say one of the best ways to get young people in is to talk to teachers at your local schools. I work a lot with teachers, and they are always so eager and so keen to get involved with history projects. And I'm sure if you reach out to them, they will be absolutely delighted to hear from you and to work out ways that that you can work together and you can get your records into the schools in the local area. So that would be my top tip.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks for the top tip, Claire. And Aimee, I will turn to you. Sorry to put you on the spot, but I'm sure we could learn from you in terms of your insights in, what inspires and engages young people. I know there's not a one size fits all answer to that, but what would you draw on?
So for me, I feel like outside of schools, I feel like to engage like people around my age, like in my 20s and teenagers even, is relating the content of what you do to current affairs, for example. So for me, I went out and searched for something like YHP because the Black Lives Matter movement kind of made me more aware of like what am I contributing to discussions and debates about like how the significance of Black people in the UK, for example. So I looked for things that I could do to participate. So that's how it was for me.
Brilliant, thank you. I noticed in the chat Colin Hyde talking about interviews with musicians as something that might interest young people, and Colin asks it might be a bit early for grime, but perhaps not. Actually, Colin, one of our interns in the centre working with the Museum of Youth Culture project at the moment, is actually working on a research project on the recent history of grime and youth culture. So huge amounts of interesting research going on those kind of topics. Anyone else on the panel want to say anything about engaging people? I mean, Helen and Colin, what excites people about sound heritage and about those sound archives? What are the hooks that get people interested?
Can I just make a quick point about engaging people? It really, I mean, it's such an obvious point and everyone will probably know it, but you often have to go to where the young people are because they won't come to you. Often I've seen youth groups looking for stuff to do in the city who have no idea that there's a county archive. And it's when you go to them and you tell them about these things, that they exist, that they can then also make the decision themselves to go and get involved. So getting out of the archive and into the community is really important. So I think Helen was going to say something about.
All I was going to say, Colin, was a similar kind of thing. Create partnerships, work with organisations that are already working with young people can be a way to cross that bridge, I suppose. Make it relevant as well, I would suggest, and try and be creative in the way you do things. So, bring it alive through art or poetry or music or something like that is potentially an interesting way to engage anybody, actually, not necessarily just young people, but anybody looking at it through a different lens, really.
I totally agree with that, Helen. All of those kind of new partnerships and new collaborations, doing things creatively, it's so enriching for all of us in what we do, isn't it? But it helps us to kind of reach new participants and new communities, really valuable. And again, just a reminder to have the chat open because there's loads of brilliant expertise and ideas and tips and questions and discussion going on in the chat. So do tune into that. I think we'll dip into another show and tell object very briefly. I hear there's Valerie Glass who's really keen to show us a teacup. Valerie, you're going to have to be speedy. So it's going to have to be in a kind of in 50 words or less type challenge, but we would love to see your teacup. Thank you.
I'll talk quickly. Well, when I was doing my family history, which I've been doing for, I have to confess, about 50 years, I discovered that the brother of one of my goodness knows how many great grandfather had been a potter on Tyneside. And I was interested to know more. I found a magazine article by a collector, and I managed to track down this collector. And eventually I went to see him and his wife, and I was able to purchase this beautiful teacup that Thomas Patterson of Sheriff Hill Pottery had made about 200 years ago. So it's not one that's been in the family all that time, but I was really thrilled to actually be able to buy it. And it was made at a time when lots of potteries were open around Tyneside. This was in Gateshead, and really, I suppose it's typical of the industries that were developing around that time. Sadly, he went bankrupt several times, and the pottery eventually closed. But I've got one of his teacups, and it's quite a modern design, I think. It's got a lovely handle.
It's lovely, Valerie. Thank you so much for sharing that. I can see other people coming in to get a good look at that lovely teacup there. And I love stories that start with that detective work. That really paid off for you. Thank you so much for sharing that with us today. If you're not able to talk about your own show and tell on camera, just a reminder that we would love to hear your stories about your objects over on Twitter, and you can use the HistDay20 hashtag so that we can find your stories, because I think what this is really showing is what we all knew, really, isn't it? And what Gary illustrated at the start is that objects really give us that incredibly immediate and powerful connection with the past, in a similar way to the way that sound does, as we heard from the oral history archive. So I have another question for the panel, and it's something we've touched on already, but I think we've all heard an awful lot over the last year, certainly since March, about the increasing importance of the local, in the context of the pandemic, of local lockdowns, of social distancing, restrictions on travel, working from home, the increased importance of people's local place and their local community and the local. Is that something that you've really seen in your work? I mean, Daniela and Claire, I think you've hinted that it's a bit of a yes from you, but I'd love to know more from the whole panel. In what ways have you seen this interest in the local? What is the local? Does it just mean the place that you're in? Does it, is it your kind of 2-mile radius? What does the local mean to people? Have you seen that growth of interest in focus on local and community this year? And, have you engaged with that? Have you responded to it? So if anyone on the panel wants to take that.
Well, I'll
Gary,
start.
please.
Because I suppose history begins at home is like the hyper local. You couldn't get much more local than home. But that expands out. One of the themes we were looking, well, in fact, this week we're just coming to the end. Our theme for the fortnight has been home. History begins at home. And one of the things which people have been talking to, that they're becoming more interested in the history of the house which they live in. They're interested in who's lived there before, what's original in the house, what it would have been like before. And one of the things which we've been encouraging people to do in a very sensible, socially distanced way, though, is if you want to find out more about your house and at the same time do something to tackle loneliness, well, why don't you call up the person who's been living in your street the longest? There may have been somebody who's been there for 40 years who would love to tell you a bit of their local history. They can give you some of the gossip about people who've lived there, which you won't find out any other way. Might be libelous, but it's a great way of killing 2 birds with 1 stone, making social connections, tackling that loneliness, and getting engaged in something which is a personal connection to local history.
I love that. I think there's a whole research project there, isn't there? When does oral history become gossip? What's the interface between history and gossip? And I think that I want to be in that place on the Venn diagram. That sounds fantastic. Any other thoughts on that then from our panel? What the local means to your project, how you've seen increased interest in the local or community over the past year? Helen.
I'm probably stating the obvious here, but I suppose over the last year there's been certain people have had a lot of time on their hands, so there have been a lot of projects, I think, mulling around that people have been able to commit time to, certainly at a local level. And I think there's also been a lot of reflection going on personally, so people are looking at their surroundings, they're spending more time locally, they're walking down the streets and looking up at things, you know, and that kind of thing. And I think with older folk as well, who are usually quite often the targets for oral history are those older members of society. We want to get those stories, so I think there's been an element of that in it, although again there have been the challenges of, well, actually we can't sit in a room with them and record them, but there again have been innovative ways around that. So there's been, not ideally online recording in the sense of quality recordings, but at least that work's been done. And some projects have been doing telephone recording, for example. So there have been ways around it. So yeah, I think it's people's worlds have maybe got a little smaller, perhaps, over the last year, and people are just looking at what's around them, and that's perhaps prompting them. Certainly my experience of within Imoha, you have, you know, a good number of local projects coming forward asking for help and guidance on oral history, and that has continued at a steady pace over the last year. It hasn't really slowed down, so that's been really encouraging.
That's brilliant. Something, isn't there, about our world's getting smaller, but somehow, you know, we want to look at the detail. We're interested in seeing the detail. I think there's something really, really rich there. Aimee, I think you wanted to come in on this too.
Yeah, our project is quite wide-ranging because it covers like connections between Africa and the UK, but I feel like in the sense of community, it's like bringing it's like affecting all the like African communities in the UK, in the sense that it's bringing them to the forefront and like to central to the discussion about the British healthcare system. Yeah, so just bring in people who may not have been represented into like the limelight.
Yeah, that's a brilliant perspective on this, actually, Aimee, because yeah, your project is you know, covers global history and those global connections and networks and relationships. But I know it's a sort of an old chestnut, isn't it? But the idea that all history is local, all history is local history, and that within those big kind of global narratives, there's always personal and individual and local stories within that, and those are the ones that you're recovering and that are so rich and so suggestive. Yeah, wonderful. We're coming up towards the end of our session, but I wondered if I could just ask the panel one last question, which is something we've touched on already, around different forms of engagement. And I wondered if you could say anything about what you're doing in kind of different media and different formats to engage people at the moment. So we've talked about the online, we've talked about the analog, we've talked about the real world. How do those fit together? What are the difficulties, and what are the potentials? Because I think we've all learned so much over this year, haven't we? We've learned skills and new ways of doing things that we're going to take forward long after this pandemic. It really is opening up new worlds. But you know, what are the insights that you've gained from those multiple ways of engagement? Any thoughts on that?
I'll come in if that's okay. So obviously BALH has gone a bit bonkers for the digital this year, which has been fantastic. And we found that there are lots of people out there who weren't necessarily engaging with us because we were relying on one or two forms of engagement. So what we've really done is broaden the ways that we try and reach out to people. So as Daniela and I were saying, we've done the 10-minute talks, and originally that was for members only. Then we broadened it out. Originally it was a PowerPoint and notes, then we included videos. So you've got people who have different interests and different strengths getting in touch with that. We've got the podcast, the online seminar series, then we've got things that are much more interactive, because obviously podcasts and seminar series, it's quite a passive experience. So, you know, the digital skills training, which is actually, I would say hands-on, but it's obviously virtual hands-on training for local history, and Q&A sessions to really help build our local history societies skills in these digital areas, because one thing we've noticed is that a lot of people weren't quite geared up for the complete shift to the digital. And as the national charity for local history, we've got the means of supporting some of these other societies to do that. And we've also seen the range of people interested in local history really increase, as lots of people have said, from students right through to, you know, people who are retired, or people who've never had an interest in their local history before, suddenly having this time on your hand and
great.
being home. You know, it's
Brilliant.
really
I just really briefly, Daniela, I think we'll let Bal have the last word on this. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add to what Claire said in terms of making it more interactive. Again, just kind of talking about the digital, but social media, the way that it's expanded, that's kind of really helped in terms of being interactive, just by posing questions, asking people, what do you think of this blog post? Even at the beginning of a week, saying, you know, what local history are you doing this week? Like, please share that with us. So even though people have had to adapt to that, as Claire said, it's doing something that, yeah, it's a bit more hands-on, it's a bit more inviting. So using our social media platform, obviously to promote our digital initiatives, but also to have that kind of interactive element and to invite more people. I mean, our following has increased exponentially, so that's one of the things that we've seen from doing that.
That's great. I have to say, aren't Daniela and Claire good? They're sort of, they're plugs for the British Association for Local History. You are brilliant ambassadors for your organisation, and I think we'll let you have the last word on that, because I think everything you've said there about kind of broadening out and diversifying and including different people in new ways is so positive and resonates with so much of what we've heard from the other projects. So I realise we've got a packed day today. You're probably rushing to other History Day content, catching up with things online. So I think this is time to draw the session to a close. I'd like to thank our wonderful panel of speakers. You can thank them by clapping virtually in Zoom or in the more traditional manner for their wonderful presentations. Such inspiring projects, they really are. Thank you for taking time to share those with us. Lots of inspiration clearly in the chat. Lots of people will be following up your projects in the future. I'd like to thank everyone who's come, particularly everyone who brought along your wonderful show and tell objects. We were never going to have time to see them all, but it was great to see them in the grid on Zoom. Do tweet about them if you'd like to share your story. I'd like to thank the History Day organisers for making the event possible, and the Being Human Festival too. A recording of this will be available in due course. Thank you so much for joining us today, and see you over on Twitter to continue the conversation. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks. Bye.